right, everyone, we're 1 minute in, so we'll go ahead and get started. We might have some folks trickle in. It's all good. We want to respect everyone's time. I know we're excited to have this conversation. So a big welcome to those folks who are joining us live, and for those who are watching the recording afterwards, a big hello to you as well. Very excited for this chat and learn today. My name is Zara Chaudhary. I am the Global DEIB Impact Manager at Power to Fly. We're going to have a wonderful conversation today, but before I introduce our amazing speaker, just some friendly reminders for you about this event and about how we're going to move forward today. So please, we encourage and invite folks to turn your cameras on. We love engagement. We love participation. If your camera is on, just a note that you will show up on the live recording if you do turn your mic on. This is being recorded, and we'll send an email with the rewatch link in 1 to 2 days for folks to kind of watch and learn and enjoy this afterwards. If you would like to remain anonymous with any sort of question you might have or with any comments you want to share, please message me privately. I'll pull it into the discussion. But also in the meantime, would love to encourage folks to write in the chat. Again, encouragement for interaction and engagement is big for us. So please feel free to drop some thoughts in the chat. And again, if there's anything that you kind of want to pull in anonymously into the conversation, you can message me directly as well. And then also you can keep up with us on social. So we are at Power to Fly. We also have a YouTube channel, so go ahead and subscribe there. Lots of great content and events for you all in those locations. And now I get to introduce our amazing speaker, Shruti Ganeriwala. So Shruti has 17 plus years of HR experience across a variety of roles, including learning, talent management, well-being, DEI, HR business partnering, and organization transformation. So much. I'm so excited to dive in. So she has worked across developing and developed markets and has been with Unilever Australia for 8 years. Shruti's deep passion lies in helping organizations build a diverse and inclusive culture where everyone feels they belong. On a personal front, Shruti gets her energy from spending time with her husband and 10-year-old daughter, reading, doing yoga, and staying connected with friends and family all over the world. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to kick it over quickly to Shruti for a quick introduction so we can say hello.
Thank you so much, Zara, and thanks for the very kind introduction. Really looking forward to this conversation. Really passionate about, building cultures of belonging, and diversity, equity, and inclusion is at the heart of it. So really looking forward to the conversation and meeting so many people who are like-minded and as passionate as I am about this topic.
I love it. Yeah, so let's dive in. So we know that our topic of conversation today is really avoiding the pitfalls of early stage DEI strategies, right? And where to really start. So we have some questions that I will be asking Shruti. Again, feel free to comment things in the chat. If you hear something and a question pops up into your mind, please drop it into the chat. We will hopefully have some time at the end to answer audience questions as well. So please, we know that some folks submitted some questions beforehand. So as we get to them, we ask that folks continue to just submit any questions you may have. So before we dive in, Shruti, let's start with the why, right? Why is this important? And how can DEI initiatives impact companies' employee engagement?
That's an excellent question, Zara. Thanks for the question. And I think the way I like to think of this is, of course, DEI initiatives and the diverse representation that we have, the culture we build, et cetera, will impact employees' engagement. But I think the big why here is that it's an enabler for business performance. So in my mind, you can look at all the research and you can look at all the studies, which I won't get into. But in my mind, having diversity in the room and having a culture that allows that diversity to thrive is an enabler of business performance, whether it's diversity of ideas, whether it's different points of view in the room, whether it's different people challenging different things. So I think of diversity as, cognitive diversity, the way you think, the way you articulate things, etc. Also demographic diversity, people with different backgrounds, different lived experiences, bring different perspectives. So to me, it's very clear that this is an enabler of business performance. And of course, employee engagement and everything else comes along the way, but that's why we need to do this. Like, to my mind, hopefully, we do not continue to have conversation on why this is important, because it is quite well established that this is important. But to me, it's a big enabler of business performance.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that that's an interesting way to think about it too, right? Because I think a lot of times folks are just focused on like the emotion side of it, right? Or how it makes employees feel. I like that you also brought in the fact that no, this is a good sort of marker of how a business is performing as well. So that's awesome. And thank you for introducing that part into this conversation as well. So clearly you have vast experience around this. And so considering that experience, what does a successful DEI approach look like? What are some strategies, right, to implement that approach? And what are some of the key areas that we should be focusing on?
Yeah, so I would say, Sarah, when we think about this at Unilever, I think for us it's really important when we think of DEI that we have to essentially internally we have to represent our organization should be such that it represents the communities and consumers we serve. So I think that's our starting point. Like that's anything that that's something that we always start with, which is like, if in the industry, if there are 50% women outside in the consumer base or in our communities, or if you think of Australia where I'm based, if 1 in 5 Australians have a disability, do we represent that internally in our organization? So I think the starting point for us is internally, we need to represent the communities we serve and the consumers we serve, because that's when we come up with the best solutions, the best design, the best products, and so on. So I think that's the first thing, to be very clear of what you're trying to do. And I think once you're clear of that, for me personally, I've seen in my last few years, I think the biggest thing is to think of a 360 approach when it comes to any DEI initiatives. The way we do it in my organization is that, of course, there's an element of top-down priority. So there's a huge, sponsorship from our leadership team. So what is top-down focus for us? What is our global Unilever has a focus, etc. So what's our top-down priorities? But then, you need to match that with bottom-up passion of people. So a lot of our DEI initiatives at Unilever is led by employees. And a lot of that is bottom-up. I'm passionate about disability and I want to work in this space. Can I join this committee or this ERG and work in this area? So I think for me, over the years, I've realized what's really important to make DEI successful is to have a top-down of priorities, to have a bottom-up of passion, but then to round that off with a lot of expertise, industry expertise. So we are very conscious of working with industry partners. We don't know best. We are not specialists in any of these fields, whether it comes to disability, whether it comes to race and ethnicity, whether it comes to gender. Like, we're not the experts. We know what we want to do, but there's so much expertise around in our local markets. So I think for me, it's really important when I start thinking of DEI is to think about that 360, the top down, the bottom up, and to, have around it the industry expertise. So I would say that is probably the one big thing I would think of when we think of approach.
Wow. I'm definitely like a visual person, so I appreciate you kind of painting this picture, right? Of like, it's not just top down or bottom up, right? It's kind of like both. And I appreciate that sort of approach. And so, kind of like a follow-up to this question, because again, for some folks, they might be starting this brand new and they're not sure where to start. What are some of the key focus areas that you would really kind of suggest that people start focusing on?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. I think one I would say is very different in every organization's context, right? So I think it is really important to think about what is important in your organization. And that starts from just looking internally. If, looking at doing an audit of your own employee base, like what is the diversity that we have? Of course, that has its own challenges. And at some point we should talk about that, like its own challenges with disclosure and privacy and all of that. But with whatever information we have at this stage, like doing an audit of your own employee base, I would say that's an important one. Getting a sense of experience that people have in your organization, and then also looking at what are the trends in your industry, like what is happening outside in your local industry. Like, I think you need to marry those 2-3 things together to think about. Like, I can of course go on and talk about what's important at Unilever, and at some point I will do that. But I think it is very specific to your own organization context, and it's very specific to your local market. And doing that, like whether it's, conversations, focus groups, doing surveys, etc., getting those insights, I would say is super critical.
Yeah, I love that. I love the focus on like the internal, getting that data, right? Like figuring out where you need to look. And I also appreciate you naming that it's not going to look the same in every company or in every organization. So I love that sort of personalized approach is going to be a priority here for sure. So along those lines, right, of when we're thinking about what areas we want to focus on, who should own the creation and execution of DEI policies? If there's no one specifically assigned to the project, like would HR be the best department to handle it? What are your thoughts on that?
That is such an excellent question, Zara, and that comes up all the time. And I'm someone who's passionate about DEI, but I am also in HR. Like I do HR, and I've been in the HR industry for a long time. So I actually do have a strong view on this, which is like there are different organizations, right? Like I know of organizations which have dedicated DEI departments because they've chosen to make the investment and they think that is what they need. And you have a dedicated DEI department, which might be a part of your HR department or standalone. And they drive all the initiatives, of course, with, a support of all employees and leadership and everything. But then there are organizations, even Unilever Australia New Zealand locally, like Unilever Australia New Zealand, which is what I'm a part of and I represent. We do not have any dedicated DEI department, and we do not have anyone who is solely looking at DEI. And that's when you have a setup like that, that's when I think just thinking naturally that HR can lead it doesn't work. I think the way we drive it is through a lot of employee resource groups. And that's challenging. That has its own challenges because, people have capacity and people have capacity issues and people have day jobs and other challenges, etc. But what we've seen to be really successful is we've got a diverse, a cross-functional team of people who are passionate about different topics. So we've almost set up pillar teams on different topics, and then being very conscious on who's leading those areas, but also then creating that momentum in the organization to support those people to be successful. How do we help them create capacity? How is there an explicit message in the organization that this is important? So if you're investing your time so we've got people who are customer managers for a big account in their day job, but also, let's say, lead our LGBTQI plus inclusion pillar. Mm-hmm. So, how do we help them create capacity? How is there an explicit message in the organization that doing things like these are super critical because the organization is placing value on it? Mm-hmm. So I think in a nutshell, my answer is thinking that, an HR department or someone can drive it doesn't work. I think you have to go where the passion lies, and galvanizing people to drive this, I think, is a big one. If you can afford to have a dedicated DEI team, then why not?
No, absolutely. And I love that you brought in like ERGs, right? Employee resource groups into this, because I really do feel like companies sometimes create the space for these groups, but then they don't leverage them, right? So I love that you're like, we have passionate people who are willing to like lead this work. How are we leveraging them, right? How are we, using the folks that are passionate about this and are already kind of meeting? So I love that you brought them in, because I definitely think that's like an underutilized option for a lot of companies. So I love that you named that.
And so, Sarah, if I add to that, like the other thing there is, and we've had our own challenges, right? Like, let me be the first one to accept that we've not got it all perfect. Like, I think there's a fine balance between ERGs and people who are passionate about this topic, etc. But then finding that balance around it with some people whose core job it is HR business partnering or recruitment or hiring. How do you integrate that as part of that, or subtly encourage those people to be part of your teams? Like, for example, we're doing a lot of work right now on, we did it a couple of months back on reviewing our recruitment processes. Our recruitment process bias free? Are we asking the right questions to hire people with disability or different diverse talent, etc.? And getting our recruitment leads to be part of that team that was working on it was super critical, because we've also experienced where you have standalone ERGs and we sit in a room and come up with plans, but it all falls down because it hasn't gotten translated to the right team which is implementing it. So I think getting that mix is really important.
I love that. And I love that you clarified that, right? It's also about how do we get those key stakeholders into these spaces as well, to be like, informing the conversation, but also learning from the conversation. I love that. That's awesome. Thank you for clarifying that. So what about, right? We're talking about the different areas. So like you said, every company is different in terms of where we should be focusing. So every company will also have different areas of improvement. So what is your go-to strategy for really being able to detect these areas of improvement?
That's an excellent question. And I would say two things. I would say a balance between internal and external. So I think, going old school and having a lot of internal connects is super important. understanding the makeup of your organization today, because it sounds simple, but it is not simple at all. It is very hard. If you ask me in Unilever ANZ, do we exactly know the makeup of our organization in terms of, how many people recognize as a person with disability, how many people, are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background, which in our context is First Nations people, etc. And in some cases we do, in some cases we don't, because we've had lots of challenges with disclosure and with privacy and all of that. So I think while it sounds simple, doing some work on that is really important, understanding the makeup of your organization, and then doing a lot of just internal connects, right? Like nothing comes in the way of just being old school and having lots of one-on-one conversations, having lots of what we like to call listen and learn focus group conversations on understanding people's experience of the organization, because diversity is always two things. D&I is always two things. It's always diverse representation, but it's always a culture where that diversity can thrive, which is where inclusion and other things come in. So I think just doing an audit and understanding experience internally is super critical, because I think that will give you amazing feedback on what are our areas of improvement. So I would say that's one thing. The other thing I will say is just external. What's happening in the industry? What is a big priority for your context in the local industry? And what are things you can do differently? Like, to give you an example, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. Like when we started our work on disability agenda 2 years ago, we worked with an organization, local organization called Australia Network on Disability. And we started reviewing our processes, etc. And we were like, oh, we didn't realize we should have a policy like a workplace adjustment policy. Sorry, this is what happens in a live call when the lights just shut off in the room.
No worries.
Yeah, so my point was like getting that external inspiration is really important, because we didn't realize we should be having a workplace adjustment policy. But once we learned that, we obviously quickly designed it and implemented it. So to answer your question, how do you identify those areas of improvement? I think internal, super important. Understanding what's happening in the external market and getting insights from experts is really important. And if you're part of a large organization, like in our context, we are a large global organization, we get lots of learnings from our global team. So we tap into those learnings all the time, because while we know exactly what will work in the local market, there's global expertise that we can always tap into. So, I always think of it as these three pillars.
No, I love that. And I also just want to highlight something that you said that's so important, which is it's not just about getting diversity in the door, right? It's about how do we build that culture to keep them, right? And I know you've mentioned that a few times. I just want to really highlight that for folks. Like, I think that's a big one, right? It's focusing on both of that. It's the getting the folks in, but also like retaining them, building that culture, and then tapping into, like you said, those internal conversations. That's so important. People have so many thoughts, and I feel like companies often don't create the spaces to like hear those thoughts from like individuals directly, so I like how you painted again this great picture of like the internal aspect, but also the external, right? Like what's happening in the world and how are we learning from global teams. That's awesome. I love that. So our next question for you. So I know you started talking about this in the previous question, but like, what are the first steps we should take to start auditing our employee base? And I'll let you answer that first before I ask any follow-ups.
No, fair enough. I think auditing our employee base is super important. It's super hard. So you need to very quickly get your legal team on this together, like as the HR team or D&I team or whoever you're driving this. I think getting your legal team hand in hand on this is super critical, because every country will have its own regulations around privacy. Like we had to jump a lot of hoops before we, couple of years back, could actually do these surveys in our business where we said, and with a lot of disclaimers, this is like, if you're comfortable, this is voluntary, and millions of disclaimers, etc. We finally encouraged and attached it to why we want the information, but we finally encourage people to start sharing their diversity data if they are comfortable, which is, yes, your sexuality, whether you recognize as a person with disability, race and ethnicity background, etc., etc. So I think, how do you start auditing the base of the your base of your organization? Few things are obvious, and that, and that's data you can play around with, and you should, which is whether it's, because that is data that's recorded in your HR database, whether it be age, whether it be culture, country of origin, whether it be gender, etc. Some of the standard data which is recorded in your HR database, you can start looking at that to understand whether you have a diverse makeup. Then there is the not so obvious, not so apparent form of diversity data, which you don't have. And that's something that we have started to drive, encouraging people to share, if they are comfortable. So we also had to do a lot of work in our Workday, which is our HR system that we work with, working with our Workday team to create the fields where people can share what background, whether they recognize as a person with disability, etc. And again, we haven't cracked it. It's super hard, but we've been trying to do some waves for the last 2 years where we encourage people to share that data if they are comfortable. And one of my learnings in this has been, somebody said to me that it's really important you attach it to the why, because as an employee, as a team member, I'll be like, okay, but why do you want to know that? Why does it matter to you? Just treat me as an individual. Like, why is it important for you to know if I have a hidden disability or if I recognize as something, etc. And I think attaching it to the why has been really important. So we've been trying to do a lot of, we need this because this will help us drive our initiatives, etc., etc. So to answer your question, how do you audit the base? I think there is data that you have. We underestimate the data we have. So, use the data that you have, because we recently did, just looked at our HR data and did an analysis on age diversity in our teams. So, there's data that you have, there's data that you don't have, but you need to find ways to capture that data.
Oh, that's great. And so it sounds like, we would be almost like, whether it's a survey or something like that, right? That we're kind of asking questions to get that data. Do you have any types of questions that you would recommend that people think about including on this type of a survey?
So two things. So I would say that there are two different types of survey in my mind. There is one which is to capture data. And that's there's one to capture data, which is, quantitative data. I recognize as a person with disability, yes, no. I am from this background, and every country will have it different. For Australia, it's Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders, or both, or none of the above, etc. Or your sexuality, etc. Which also, we had to get a lot of advice from our external partners on what terminology to use, etc. So I think there's that data on quantitative data, which is very specific to your local this thing. But then there is this other element of survey, which I think you should also do, and which I know a lot of organizations do, which is around this other part of experience of the organization. Because, the diversity, do I have the diversity, but how do I experience the organization, or what is the culture? That's where we use a lot of questions. Like in our Unilever context, we would use questions like, do you believe we have an inclusive organization? And, give a rating scale. Do you believe your leaders in your team stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion? Do you have a culture in your team where you can make mistakes, where you can call out something, challenge someone, because that takes you to psychological safety? Or we also have questions like, do you believe people from diverse backgrounds can succeed in Unilever? So there are lots of these questions that you can play with. And you can also think of making this part of your standard HR engagement surveys rather than a separate survey, just in the spirit of simplicity. But those are the questions I would tap into typically for that experience and culture side of it.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, we definitely find that too. We're combining the surveys and actually integrating them is definitely a best practice, because survey fatigue is a real thing, right? So being intentional about how we're asking these questions is that's a great reminder around that. So there's a specific question that I want to ask you specifically around hiring and retention, right? And so can the lack of DEI focus within our hiring and retention policies affect our team? And if so, how?
That's a great question. And I interpret this as, what do we do in terms of diverse hiring? So we can all talk about, we want to represent the communities we serve, this, that, etc. But are we actually hiring? People with disability? Are we actually hiring people with different ethnic backgrounds, etc.? And I think that is super critical, but I think it is really important to remember, and I'm always very passionate about this, that change takes time. And sometimes you have to get your house in order before you can actually go and hire. And this is something I've learned over the years, because when I started working on the disability agenda 2-3 years ago, we spent a lot of time on education, on internal processes, implementing new policies like the workplace adjustment policy I spoke about, or reviewing our own recruitment process to see if it was bias-free, to see if we were asking the right questions at the right stage, if our line managers were upskilled on unconscious bias, this, that, etc. So we did a lot of work on that. But along the way, as many of us are, started getting quite impatient for actions. And, we are in the FMCG industry and we are fast moving and we want to see action. And I was like, okay, this is great, but we're not actually hiring people with disabilities. So, we're actually not moving the needle. What do we do? So I think my biggest reflection has been that, one, you have to give it time, give it time, whether it's a couple of years, whether it's 6 months or whatever, to get things in order. And once you've done that, again, it never ends, right? Like we are still updating our recruitment process. We are still constantly educating our leaders, ourselves, our recruitment teams, our managers, etc. But this year, since late last year, early this year, we've actually started doing a lot of hiring of people with disabilities in that specific example. So my answer to your question is, does it impact? Yes, it does. But always remember that there's a phase. If some agenda is really, really new to you and your people don't know, your processes are not bias free for that agenda, etc., you need to give it sufficient time for that to evolve internally. You also need to give it sufficient time to probably form some right partnerships to be able to hire. Again, for the longest time, again, I think we were hiring people with disabilities. We might not even know because people don't have to tell you if they have a disability. That's one. Second is, for the longest time, I don't think our processes had any bias, so anybody could apply. But what we've done in the last 2 years or 18 months is we've actually updated all our job adverts to say, if you're a person with disability or if you're a person with this background, we encourage you to apply. So like, we've made those small nuances and changes. We now work with specific recruitment agencies in Australia, which help us hire with people with disabilities. And that itself has made a huge change for us versus in the past, we were just advertising on LinkedIn and some other networks like that, etc. So my point is, it is really important to do that work because the rubber hits the road when you're actually hiring people with disabilities or people with different background, etc. However, you have to give yourself some time to work on a few things before we get there.
Yeah, no, I love that. Such great wisdom you're sharing, right? Because I think also people do get very impatient and they're like, oh, we got to do this right now. But also I like what you said around intentionality, right? Put in the work on the front end so that when we do roll it out, right, it's not, doesn't, harm people in any way, because we would never want that. So I love what you're saying about almost giving yourself grace and knowing that some of these changes are going to take some time. I also appreciate what you said about this is never ending, right? Just because you put something in place doesn't mean that you don't revisit it. We should always be revisiting things, right? And reviewing things. So I love that reminder. And I also appreciate what you said about we're not always experts. And so we should be pulling in other partners who can help us with it, right? We don't have to go at it alone. And I think a lot of times people do feel all this pressure, right? I have to do this. I have to figure it out. But I love what you said, you were partnering with specific companies to hire specific types of talent. It's like you don't have to do it by yourself. Where can we partner with? I love that. That was wonderful. I appreciate all of the illumination of these different sort of tips and strategies that you're sharing. So what are the most common challenges that companies tend to face when they are creating their DEI initiatives?
Cool. That's a great question. I'll say a couple of things. I'll say one is trying to do too many things at the same time. So DEI is one area where, again, going back to my earlier point of let's tap into people's passion and it should be bottom up, etc. That's amazing. But then a lot of people have a passion about a lot of things and you have to be really choiceful. We've got a very clear strategy on these are the areas we are working on this year. But of course, around the year, we'll have people with, different ideas on why don't we do something like this? Why don't we do something like that, etc. And again, all ideas welcome, and that's great, but you need to find a way of funneling it, putting it in the backlog, etc. So I think the first thing for me that's really, really important is being really choiceful, because you genuinely can just do a lot. I'll talk about the areas that we focus on in a bit, but there are areas that we don't do, but we could be doing because there is so much to do in this space, right? So I think being really choiceful about the areas you play in while having a longer term strategy, in my mind, is super critical. I think I would say that is one of the big things. The second big thing I will say is never underestimating the importance of education. So the importance of just constant upskilling and education. And I know it sounds like a very HR learning person to say that, but especially in areas like DEI, when we first started at Unilever ANZ, we worked on the gender pillar for a long time, right? Of course, all of us have been working on that. But for example, we started working on disability 3 years ago. We started working on our race and ethnicity pillar, which for us is our reconciliation action plan a couple of years ago. When we started work on that, we realized that many of us, myself included, our leaders, etc., did not know much about those pillars. So we had to do a lot of work on education, what is the language you use? What are the stats? What are the things you should say, should not say, etc. Like constant education. I would never underestimate the importance of that constant education because it's an ongoing learning journey. I would say that. The other thing I will say is just leader sponsorship. Like we all know, it's one of the things we say for everything, but I think we are really lucky because we've got a lot of sponsorship for our CEO. But if we don't get that top level buy-in quickly enough, I think it becomes an HR thing. The last thing I will say in terms of challenges, like not spending enough time to deeply understand the issue. Like I think that is really important. Spending time as a DEI team, etc., to deeply understand the issues or what you're trying to change is really important. And I'll take a moment here and give you a small example. Many years ago, we were trying to update our parental leave policy. So we've got a paid parental leave policy for so many weeks, so many months, etc. And we spent some time thinking, okay, we need to make it more progressive. This is what's happening in the industry. This is the budget we have. What can we do? And one of the options we could have gone for was to increase the number of paid months of our parental leave. We could have done that. And that was one of the options on the table. But we actually spent a bit of time researching. We spent a bit of time talking to external partners, etc. And we realized that one of the big issues in Australia at the moment, if anybody's joining from Australia, is that superannuation is pension equivalent in Australian context. So one of the big issues in Australia is that women on average retire with superannuation, which is 40% or something roughly like that, less as compared to men. And that is one of the biggest causes of homelessness in elderly women in Australia. And the reason for that is because women get out of the paid workforce for caring responsibilities and for other responsibilities. And while you're on parental leave, you're not earning superannuation. So the point I'm trying to make is we could have gone with the option of actually increasing the number of paid months of parental leave. Alternatively, what we chose to do, which was industry leading when we did that, was we said you've got paid parental leave. And in Australia, most people take paid leave and they take unpaid leave. And we said, during paid leave, of course, you're getting all your pay and benefits, but during unpaid leave, we will still pay you your superannuation because we understand that that's an issue in the industry. We understand that most women are taking primary care or parental leave. And we understand in the long term, that's an issue. In the short term, it's better for you to get paid 6 months instead of 4 months that we are currently giving. But in the long term, this is an issue. And this is where we want to lead the industry on this. So I'm giving this example to make the point that we spent a lot of time doing this because we know it would have been a bigger sell in the company where we said, instead of 4 months paid leave, you actually get 6 months paid leave. But we chose to do this because we spent a bit of time and we got a lot of advice externally from the industry and everything. So my point, I think, is what are some of the big challenges? I think education, I think spending time deeply understanding the issues. And I think, not underestimating the importance of being really, really choiceful about the areas you work in.
Oh my gosh, what a great example, right? Because I think that's so important to really, again, show you had the option of like, yeah, we could just do this and it'll be almost like immediate sort of, happiness with folks, but really thinking about like the issues in the industry and like, I love that. I love that you all chose to do that. And you spent the time, like you said, you spent the time on the front end doing that research, right? Really understanding what the issue is. That's awesome. That's great. I love that Unilever did that. So my next question for you, and this comes up a lot, especially with global companies, right? So like I'm based in the US. So I know a lot of times when we talk about DEI, the first two metrics that pop up are like gender and race and ethnicity, right? But it really, like you've mentioned, it looks different in different countries and in different locations. So beyond gender, what are other DEI metrics that we should be looking at, keeping in mind that global lens?
I think that is a great question. And I think I can talk about what are the areas we focus on. Like we said, it's different for everyone. It's different in every country, every company, etc. But I can talk about what we focus on. So at Unilever Australia New Zealand, we've identified some focus areas for us. And the way we've done that is seen what's important in our industry, but also understand global Unilever priorities, because globally Unilever has again done a lot of work on understanding priorities. So our strategy is such that we've got 4 big pillars that we focus on. So gender diversity, of course, is a big one. And, something we've been doing for years, but can't stop. So gender. Then we've got people with disability. So that's a big pillar for us. It's a fairly new pillar for us. Like in Australia, New Zealand, we've started this pillar maybe 3 years ago versus gender, etc., which has been at the start of our DEI journey. So people with disability is the second pillar for us. The third one I would say is LGBTQI plus inclusion. So that's super important for us. So that's our third pillar. And our fourth pillar is what is race and ethnicity in Australian context. It's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and increasing their representation, but basically race and ethnicity as in whichever form it translates into different countries. So we've got these 4 vertical pillars. one of the things, and we've had these pillars for a few years, one of the things we did late last year for our strategy for this year was, while these 4 pillars are important, there's so much that happens in the intersectionality. There's so much conversation now in intersectionality in the industry that, you're not just a woman, or you're not just a person with disability. You're a woman who might have a disability, who might recognize who might be an Aboriginal woman, etc. So I think the intersectionality across pillars is really important. What we also realized in the way we were doing things was every pillar had a team and every pillar was driving an agenda, but there was so much overlap that was happening and we were not capitalizing that really well. So what we updated in our strategy last year was, we said these are our 4 pillars and they continue to be important and they are super critical in our focus areas. But along with these 4 vertical pillars, we will now also have some horizontal pillars that cut across all of these. And that's when we started our specific pillars of recruitment, bias-free and inclusive recruitment. And that cuts across, because if I train hiring managers, I don't want to train hiring managers on how to hire people with disabilities. I want to train them on being completely bias-free when it comes to DEI. So we've got recruitment as a pillar. Then we've got training and upskilling, because again, that cuts across everything. We've then got, in our context, we've got factories, and we've called out factory as a separate pillar or manufacturing as a separate pillar, because otherwise we were realizing a lot of our initiatives were ending up being head office based. But factories, where you have people, doing shift-based work determined by enterprise agreements, you needed a different focus. And we've got a 4th pillar around inclusive marketing. So Unilever, of course, has big brands, does a lot of work in marketing, advertising, etc. And we've called out a 4th pillar where we said, cutting across all of these areas of diversity, how can we ensure our marketing is inclusive? So anyways, to answer your question in a nutshell, I would say our 4 pillars are our 4 pillars: LGBT, race and ethnicity, gender, and people with disability. But then we've got focus areas that cut across these.
I love that. I'm loving this conversation. First of all, I feel like I'm learning a lot about Unilever and what you all do, and it sounds amazing. And I also love what you said, because I think a lot of companies do like the vertical pillars, like you were just saying, but I like what you said about, and then you have horizontal pillars, right? That kind of go across and between. And I think that's so important, because again, sometimes, as I was mentioning earlier, people sometimes are like siloed in this work, right? So how are we really making sure that we're like you said, there's going to be a lot of overlap and a lot of similarities, right? So how are we intentionally, proactively thinking about that? I love this visual of like the vertical pillars, but also like the horizontal cutting across all of the pillars. That's awesome. I love that.
It's funny, Zara, I'm realizing you and I are visual people. So
100%. I love it. There's different types of learning styles, so I'm definitely more of I like painting the picture and really sort of seeing it. And I love that we're aligned on that. So my next question for you is, I know we've been talking a lot about, it's not just about the diversity, it's also about how we keep people, right? So how can we really foster a DEI based culture?
That's an excellent question. And on this, I'll start by saying something. I'm a big believer that culture is made up of hardware and software. You've probably heard this term before, but I'm a big believer that when you build culture, you have to build it basis hardware and software. Hardware being, your policies, your processes, and software being, your leadership, your support to employees, etc. So I think when it comes to DI, there is so much work you have to do on the hardware. Do you have right policies in place? Do you have progressive policies, whether it's your parental leave policy, whether it's your workplace adjustment policy, so on and so forth? What are the processes? Like, is your recruitment bias free? When people walk in the door, what do they see first? Are all your conversations subtitled, et cetera, Like, there is so much to do. Is our communication style, inclusive for people with different learning styles, et cetera, as we were just talking about. So I think there is so much. I think culture is built on hardware and having those right policies, processes, etc. But a large part of culture is also built basis the software. So finding that right balance between the two. And when I say software, I mean leadership role modeling. I mean, what are the messages our leaders are sending? Storytelling. Are our leaders talking about this? Are our leaders talking about, are our leaders in the old world, now hybrid world has changed, but in the old world, are our leaders comfortable when someone gets up and has to leave at 4 o'clock because they have to pick up their kids from daycare or school or whatever? So, what are the leaders? What are the messages? I still remember our CEO long ago, like 4 or 5 years back, our old CEO said in one of our company town halls, and this was the pre-COVID world where everybody was like in office 5 days a week, etc. And he said one of the comment that I just detest and I hate, and I hope, and he said this in a company town hall, I hope I hear no one say this, is when someone gets up from the desk and leaves at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, another friend makes a comment, oh, leaving half day today, what happened? So he's like, I just hate that comment and it undermines everything we do. Can I please never hear that comment in our office? So like, I think, but again, that was such an incredible example of, and he used to be this big believer of, I'm also going to, he was an older, a male, and he would be like, I'm going to leave at 4 o'clock and I'm going to leave loudly and tell people I'm going now because I need to go, do this, etc. So make it comfortable. I don't want to sneak out of office at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock because I don't want anyone to see me leave. Yeah. So I think like, what are the messages your leaders are sending, the storytelling, the culture you build, the visible acts of allyship, like, we've encouraged as a D&I team, we've gone to our D&I board and our CEO and everyone and said, well, actually, maybe you should be, putting pronouns in your email signature, add this to your LinkedIn profile, etc. So what are the visible acts of allyship? So I would say, what is it that we're doing on our hardware? What is it we are doing on the software? And finding the right balance between the two is super critical. I'll share a quote here, Zara, which always has stayed with me. And I always like that to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you've probably heard it, it's on Google, etc. Like, diversity is being invited to the party. So am I invited to the party? Inclusion is about, am I asked to dance? And equity is playing music that everyone can dance to. So I love that quote in my mind where, yes, I can get the best diverse representation. Do I have a culture where people feel included? And am I creating opportunities where everybody can equally participate?
Yeah, I love that quote, and I love that example. And what an incredible example from your leadership, from your old CEO as well. I often tell companies, like, what your leaders do really normalizes a lot of the behaviors and expectations for the rest of folks. So again, when you have your leaders really modeling these awesome ways of allyship and really setting the tone, like you said, it makes other people feel comfortable, right? It makes them like, now we don't have to like hide things, right? We can be open about it because our leader is saying that this is acceptable. So incredible example. I love that. I know we have a little less than 20 minutes left. I'd love to welcome folks to just drop in the chat. If you're still here with us, you're still engaged, drop an emoji, drop a +1. Let us know that you're still here. You're still engaged in this conversation, because I know that I am loving this and I'm learning so much from you, Shruti. This is amazing. So please drop it in the chat. Let us know that you're here and that you're learning with us. And the next question that I have for you, Shruti, actually goes back to something else that you mentioned around ERGs, right? So what role can ERGs play in our DEI efforts?
I think ERGs, in my mind, employee resource groups are super critical. There will be organizations like ours where, like I said, we don't have anyone working dedicated on DI. We don't have a DI team, and therefore ERGs are really important because actually a lot of our work happens through ERGs. Right. But even in organization context where you have a dedicated DI team, I think ERGs are super critical because they are bringing that bottom-up voice for you. Like, they are bringing that, voice rather than you sitting in a room and deciding strategies. So in my mind, ERGs are super critical for that. But like I said, I think what's really important is, yes, you need the ERG to have the point of view, etc. But especially in organizations where you don't have dedicated DI teams, making sure it interfaces with the right teams, whether it's recruitment, whether it's HR business partners, etc., is super critical. But going back, I'm probably repeating myself, going back to your question on why are ERGs critical, I think they are the voice you need. I think they are the voice. They represent their own voice. And the best thing is they represent their own voice. They also represent the voice of the team, the corridor conversations, the water cooler conversations, because they are part of those conversations. So I think bringing that conversation, to the forefront is super critical. What I have also seen in my experience, because we've also had a bit of, started an ERG, there was passion, but then no one came because they didn't have capacity. Like, we've also had a bit of that, as many organizations do with these things. Getting senior leaders involved in ERGs has been really important for us. So we had an employee resource group for disability, which we started a few years ago. Then we sort of lost purpose, lost passion, people couldn't make time, etc. And we were grappling with what to do. But then we got one of our senior leaders, who's the GM of one of our biggest business units here locally in Australia, New Zealand, to be the disability champion. So he is the champion, the senior leader champion on disability. And he actually now runs those ERG meetings. So he brings in the team, he runs the meetings, etc., which is amazing. And we've seen the participation and the passion and everything's gotten lifted in the team. So I think that is also really important to think about.
That actually leads us right into the next question. So I'm just going to ask the next question so you can just continue building on that. But I think we also got some questions in the chat around this, right? So the question that I have for you is, how would you advise getting leadership's buy-in on investing in DEI? And the specific question that was put in the chat that's around this is like, what do you do when you have all the passion in the world, but in leadership buy-in, you don't have that and you don't have the budget, right? Like, how does one convince leaders that DEI is worth the time and money to be a priority? So how do you really get that buy-in?
That's a great question, because I think like you said in the chat, like you can have all the passion in the world, but if that isn't matched by top-down sponsorship, etc., like there's only so much you can do. Yes, you can still do stuff, but there's only so much you can do. I think a few things. I would say one is education is super, super important. I think, constant education for leaders. I have worked with leaders who, have been a bit old school and, even in the new context were after, we were on the other end of the pandemic, wanted people to come back into office 5 days a week, etc. Like I've had so many of these conversations with leaders on, the world has changed. You're going to lose talent if this is what your expectations are going to be. I have changed my lifestyle. My daughter no longer goes to after school care because I've changed my lifestyle, because now I can work from home, etc., etc. So I think having those constant conversations and education with leaders, because I have also experienced there are leaders who will be on the game and who will be ahead of it, but there are leaders who will be, oh, but no, I need to see people, I need to do this, I don't think this works, etc. So having that constant education and conversation with leaders, I think, is really important. I also think sometimes just finding others, like whether it's like we like to use this term of reverse mentoring, like pairing up your leaders if they're up for it with someone completely different, diverse background, someone much younger who's come from a different kind of a setup, etc. Like pairing them up for reverse mentoring. We call it reverse mentoring, and we do use it quite a bit. And I think that really helps. So that my point being, like, I think that constant education and conversation with leaders is really important. The other thing I will say is typical for any change program that you are doing, and this is also a change you are trying to drive, especially if you don't have the buy-in as yet, would be identify those one or two influential people. Like you will have one or two leaders in that big leadership team who are more on this side of the agenda, who will get it, who will fundamentally understand it, who will have some lived experiences, etc. Like getting those one or two leaders on your side, I would say, is really important, because otherwise it just comes up as an HR thing or a DEI thing, I think is really important. The other thing I've seen, so the last thing I'll say is, so education, identifying those one or two influencers, I would say really important. The other thing I will say is, like sometimes just opening up conversations. Like I've had these conversations where we facilitated conversation in our leadership team, where we've had a few females in the board, a few males in, like I'm talking about 4 or 5 years ago, etc., where we just facilitated a conversation about experiences. Like, and so many people in our board learned so much. Oh, I didn't realize that. And like, people talking about senior leaders, like our CFO, etc., talking about the experience she had when she came back from parental leave in her other organization, etc., etc. So I think probably I'm repeating the same point, which is around education, which is around, having that constant conversation, but also identifying one or two influencers.
Oh, I love that. And again, back to that point you even made about ERGs, like finding those champions, right? Like you said, there's going to be people that are going to naturally be more aligned and more bought in, and really leveraging those folks, right, to continue to get other folks buy-in. And that piece that you said about education is crucial, because again, for a lot of folks that don't see this as important, it's usually because the education piece is missing for them, right? So really highlighting that. And someone even put in the chat, data, right? Like really bringing that data to them, almost opening their eyes to something that maybe they didn't even realize. So I love that aspect of like really approaching it from like that educational perspective. So we covered the questions that I was going to ask you, and I know we got a few audience questions. So I also want to encourage folks, if you didn't, if you have a question, you haven't dropped it in the chat yet, feel free to do that. But we did have a question come in beforehand that I wanted to kind of, throw your way, Shruti, which is someone was asking specifically about diverse candidates, right? So like within the hiring process, how do we develop them and like make them feel supported once they've entered, the process itself, right? So like, how can we really support them in the hiring and interview processes?
I think that's an excellent question. And to my mind, I think what is really important is at every step of the process, ask people about, support, or the term we use it's a common term in the industry here, and we use it internally around reasonable adjustment or workplace adjustment. And it comes from the context of people with disability. It doesn't have to be a person with disability. It is about, do you need any adjustment in the process? Do you need any reasonable adjustment in the process? And what we've realized is really important is we've started doing it only last year, a few years back, etc., when we did a full review of our recruitment process. And we've just realized that just asking that question again and again at every step of the process has been really important. Right from the time of the first phone screening, to them coming into an interview, to the final offer, to actually when they join, onboarding, etc., etc. Because also there is some stats that tells you that you have to ask people about an adjustment so many times before they have the confidence to ask for something, because they don't know you, they don't know the organization, etc. So in my mind, it's as simple as asking an adjustment. And I'll give you an example. We've had some amazing examples where someone disclosed to us, and we did not know this, they disclosed to us later, that they had anxiety, ADHD. And we asked them, as our standard process, do you need any adjustment in the interview process, etc. And the only thing they said, and it breaks my heart that someone had to say this, but the only thing they said was, no, it's absolutely fine. I might just need to take a break in the interview, and I might need a glass of water. But if I need that, I will ask for it. It was such a beautiful answer, but it just made me realize sometimes just asking the question was just beautiful. So to my mind, the only thing you can do is ask the question, be genuine, and ask the question again and again. And terminologies like, do you need an adjustment, is actually a very standard terminology. And even if someone asks for it, doesn't mean that they have to disclose anything about their diversity to you if they don't want to.
Right. Oh my God, I love that. Also, because I feel like we often ask candidates, if you need reasonable accommodations, right? Beforehand. But I love this kind of consistent follow-up of do you need any adjustment, right? Is there anything I love that, right? Different touch points to kind of check in with folks. That's so beautiful, because I feel like that doesn't happen often. And again, what a difference that could make for diverse candidates, right? Who might need extra, support, or maybe they have some feedback for us as they're going through the process. What an excellent way to kind of see how we could adjust things to better support them. I love that. That's a wonderful practice.
Can I add to that, Zara, that it's really important to use the terminology that is understandable in your industry? Because when you say reasonable accommodation, what struck me was our global system had it entered as reasonable accommodation. And we tried to push back and wanted it to be changed. And they said, no, this is global and we can't change it. It's reasonable accommodation. When we started putting that question, our candidates started responding to us saying, I need a day's accommodation in Sydney because I'm coming from Melbourne for this interview. And we're like, no, that's not what we meant. That's not what we meant. So we then had to, go back and forth with the global team saying, nobody understands this terminology in Australia. We need to call it reasonable adjustment. So I think it's really important to get the words right in your context.
I love that. And what a great clarification there too, right? Because I'm thinking these are two different things, but they might actually be very similar depending on, like you said, the language. But again, I think often companies, what they aren't doing is consistent check-ins on that, right? It's more if you need this, email us in advance in the beginning, and then what, right? And then what's the follow-up? So this kind of consistent touch point. I love that. And thank you for clarifying that. Language, I mean, we know this, right? In the DEIB world, language is so important. So I love that. And we have two more questions for you. So the first question I have, someone asked, what's the most important thing employers can do so that diverse hires are visible to those in a position to offer them challenges and opportunities that will help them grow their career?
It's a great question. And this comes with its own challenge, because I'll share an experience on this. So one, if people have disclosed and if they're comfortable disclosing their diversity, etc., I think one of the biggest things you can do is make sure you have sponsorship and mentoring for them. What is it that you can, after, because obviously you do so much in the recruitment process, but once they join, then you lose the connect. Right. How can you ensure that you have the right mentors and you have the right senior leader sponsors, especially if you've cracked it and hired people with disabilities, you want them to be successful, or hired people with ethnic background, etc., you want them to be successful, retained. So I think that sponsorship mentoring element is great. However, I will say you have to be really careful about this, because we had an experience where we hired interns with disabilities through a program last year, because it's an industry program here, and we said we'll hire interns with disability. And with the best of intent, with the most amazing intent, we organized a session for those interns with our CEO, just to get to know her, have a conversation, etc. And we received a bit of feedback later from them because we asked for feedback on on the experience. And I told them we were doing this for the first time. Tell us your experience. And we received feedback saying that they felt a bit spotlighted as interns with disabilities. And that was not our intent. So the point I'm making is, it's amazing. We should find them opportunities, etc. You have to do it very carefully. There are nuances around it. We had not intended it for it to be like that. We were just like so happy that we had hired interns with disabilities. We wanted to give them exposure. They felt spotlighted when we did that. So you have to be really careful how you do that.
Yeah, that's such a great reminder, right? That we have to really check in with folks. How do they want to be supported, right? Instead of assuming. And I love what you brought up about intent versus impact, right? We talk about that a lot in DEI work. Like, again, your intent was one thing, but the way that it landed for folks is another. So just being aware of that is a great sort of reminder. We have one more question, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So someone is asking, what is one of the learnings that you have from your strategy building experience that would be a good example of what we could avoid when we are crafting our DEIB strategy?
That's an excellent question. I might have to think about this. The only, I would say probably would be like, one would be the siloed approach, because I've personally done that a few years. So I have led the DEI strategy for many years now. And for quite a few years, we were like, okay, we're doing this. Mm-hmm. Like you work focusing on these 4 pillars. And we then learned that there was so much overlap and these pillars were not talking to each other while they could. And as an employee experience, we were going to our employees saying, today you're getting a training on disability. Now you're getting a training on gender diversity. Now you're getting a training on that. So like one of my learnings has been, I was taking a very siloed approach till I really got my head across intersectionality and cuts across and commonality across the silos would be, I think, one thing. And the other thing I would say is we experience this with our board, which, like I said, when you have a lot of passion, we would take a strategy with a lot of ideas on it, etc. And then we would get feedback like, oh, but we should work on ageism. We should work on age diversity. Oh, we're not as yet working on disability, etc. So one of the things I started adopting then was this backlog and funnel mindset. These are the areas we're working on today. These are the ideas we've received, and these are in the funnel, and these are in the backlog. And to start with, we've looked at data. Actually, we've realized our age diversity is quite okay. So we are putting it in the backlog for this time while we focus on disability or while we focus on this. So I realize if you go with a strategy like this to a room full of people who are very passionate, they'll be like, oh, this is great. Let's do 20 more things. So I adopted this mindset of backlog. And I adopted also this mind in some cases, like when I did the disability strategy, I also adopted this mindset of 3-year looking out strategy. So this year I'll focus on education and this. Next year I'll focus on hiring. 3rd year is when I will get into advertising and looking at our packaging and products and everything. Because again, if you go with an in-year strategy, you start to get inputs on, look at this, look at this, look at this. So I think my thing would be siloed approach would be one thing. And my second thing would be just this backlog and funnel mindset to your strategy.
I love that. People get so passionate. We just want to do all the things, right? And you have to, I love that, like almost transparent communication of like, look, this is what we're focusing on now, but I hear you, right? I'm going to add this to like the backlog or the funnel. I love that. Because again, we're letting folks know that we're hearing them. We just are going to move on certain pieces right now and hold off on other pieces until we get there. I love that. That's amazing. So Shruti, I know we have 2 minutes left. I want to just really thank you for being here, for being so amazing, sharing such wonderful examples. I've learned a lot from you, and I know that the audience has too. Do you have any sort of last, things that you would want to leave the audience with to kind of think about as we wrap up today's conversation?
No, nothing different, Zara. I've really enjoyed that interaction. All I will say is make a start. Like sometimes these topics can feel big, and sometimes you can be scared about getting it wrong, saying the wrong thing, etc. And trust me when I say this, like I've made mistakes on this along the way. Sometimes said the wrong things, I've been called out for it, etc. And been like, okay, fine, this was not our intent, but this is what it came across as, and we will correct it. So I would just say, make a start. You'll get it wrong, but that's fine. It's not the end of the world. Make a start.
I love that. That humility piece is so important, right? We're all going to make mistakes. What do you do with that, right? What do you do with that feedback? You take it, you grow with it. and just recognizing that everyone makes mistakes. I love that. Shruti, thank you so much for the past 60 minutes. It has been such a pleasure. Clearly, we have a lot to learn always, right? This is never ending journey, like you mentioned in the beginning. I also just really want to thank all the folks who are joining us live and who are watching the recording afterwards. I think this work is so important, and I'm so excited that folks are interested in wanting to know where to start, right? And as Shruti said, you got to start somewhere, right? You might make mistakes. It's okay. You kind of learn, you adapt to keep moving forward. So with that, I want to say thank you to everyone. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day, and let's get out there and start this work. So thank you so much, Shruti, and thank you for joining us and Power to Fly, and make sure you continue to join our events in the future. Thank you, everyone.